What the city is talking about. The news that impacts you. Welcome to the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
Welcome to another edition of The Week That Was here on the iHeartRadio Network. I'm Aaron Rand along with Natasha Hall, and this week we'll take a look at these stories. The same polarization affecting American politics is beginning to have a spillover effect here into Canada. But a new top risk report by the Eurasia Group gauges that geopolitical risk, not just here, but across the globe. We'll talk to Evan SOLOMAN about what it's found.
And obesity in children is a problem that we've been hearing more and more about, but we haven't been hearing much on how to deal with it. Well, new recommendations have just been issued, including the possibility of surgery for kids as young as 12. Dr. LABOS explained why. And this week on the show, we had a very telling conversation about how the modern family structure just isn't really working, with both parents working full-time, So we asked, do you think we'll look back on this era of trying to do it all and say, what the heck were we thinking? And do you think when possible having one parent stay at home is a better option, even though it means having less money? You had a lot to say about that.
But we start today with a story on the global phenomenon known as McKinsey & Company, a management consulting operation whose work here with our federal government has begun to raise eyebrows when we learned that the government here has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to solicit McKinsey's advice. Daniel MARKOVITS is author of The Meritocracy Trap. He's a professor of law at Yale Law School and a founding director of the Yale Center for the Study of Private Law, and he's on the line with us right now. Mr. MARKOVITS, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
I read the article in The Atlantic. I'm going to make you the official authority on McKinsey and let our audience know exactly what this company does and why governments, both provincial and federal, at least in our country, are in bed with them.
Well, first of all, I don't want to claim to be an authority on McKinsey in particular, but management consulting as a whole is a field in which people develop generalized expertise in running things and then assume the control function of other organizations, private companies, governments, and reduce the other people who are working in those organizations to people to be managed and controlled and directed rather than to people who have a say in what it is they do and what their governments or organizations do.
Okay, so that's a good rough description. I will point out the piece you wrote is how McKinsey destroyed the middle class. That's pretty damning right there. Should we be concerned?
I think we should. I think we should be concerned both in the private sector and the public sector. So in the private sector, real quick, look, every company has to do two things. It has to make the goods and services that it provides, and it has to manage itself. And what happened in companies up till, say, 1970, in the United States especially, but also in Canada, is that the company's own workers did both of those things. So they made cars, and they ran how you go about making cars. And that meant that the workers had control over their work, and also they got paid commensurate to the fact that they were running their company. What management consultants do is they separate those tasks and concentrate the management in a narrow group of super elite people who then capture all the economic returns and all the power of running the company and reduce workers to people who are controlled and get paid less. And that's bad in the private sector. In the public sector, in a way, it's even worse. So when a government hires someone like McKinsey to run part of its governing business, it's in a deep way anti-democratic because it thinks that you can replace democratic politics and collective decision about how we should balance values with a technocrat who can simply decide what the optimal thing to do is, and everybody else has to fall in line.
When you say optimal, Are we talking dollars and cents? Is that ultimately the decision that they consider?
So I think in a company, what McKinsey will consider is dollars and cents. In a government, the advice it will give is based on whatever the technocratic objective is that's set. So if you take COVID, it might be health impact or health impact balanced against economic impact. But there's the rub, because the question how you balance our public health against our jobs or against our liberties in the context of a pandemic is a fundamental question of value that we as citizens have to decide how we want to answer. And when a government hires a consultant to answer it, that takes that decision away from us. And that's anti-democratic.
Although my question at that point would be, do we have enough, us, the public, the voters, have enough information to actually be able to make that decision?
Well, I don't think that the opposite of one extreme is the other extreme. So it's the case that we don't know all the things you need to know. There's a place for expertise in politics and in collective decision-making. But expertise should, first of all, focus on means, not ends. And second of all, should be interactive with the public. So what a talented politician does is they translate expertise into a language that the public can engage, and then leads the public to making a collective decision about how it wants to balance basic interests and values. Whereas the management consulting model is to strip the public out of that and have technocrats do more than is legitimate for them to do.
So from complete layman's perspective here, like the way I look at McKinsey and knowing very little about it, I see it as, they're being brought in as consultants to make decisions, to make recommendations so that people can make the decisions. And I feel like there's a built-in assumption that the government's going to make the decisions that are best for all of us. So is the issue here that it's about whose best interests are being put forth in these decision-making processes?
In some cases, it may be whose best interests are being put forth, so that there are certainly credible allegations in the UK in particular, for example, that when McKinsey was brought in to make some of these decisions, it stripped away benefits from, say, healthcare workers, and made decisions in a way that benefited elites. But beyond that, whose interests, look, something like COVID is a great example. People needed to work, and they needed their jobs, and people needed to be with their families, and they needed their social lives. But they also needed not to get sick and die. And how you balance your work against your social life, against your health and medical security, is something reasonable people can disagree about. And we need a politics that enables us collectively to balance those out and reach an answer that we can all live with because we have all made it. And if you outsource that decision to a consultant, it doesn't matter how honorable the consultant is. They're going to make a decision that's the one they think best, which is not the same thing as the one that's democratic or legitimate.
Right.
One of the arguments being made here, and I understand it's partly due to try to score political points, but one of the arguments being made by the opposition here on this McKinsey story federally is the fact that, hey, we have public servants, we're paying them, they're elected officials, they should be the ones making these calls, making these decisions. Is that a valid argument?
I think it's valid in two senses. First of all, they're accountable, and so they shouldn't hide behind subcontractors effectively. But second of all, and this is almost more important, if you're in a company, and especially if you're in a government, it may be that you want the people who make those decisions to be also the people who live their lives in the company or in the society. And one thing that happens when you outsource this is you also downskill your own internal capacity. So as governments rely on McKinsey more and more, they turn out to have fewer civil servants and less expertise in their civil service. And so, yes, in some sense, you have the technocrats who should be making these decisions. But what happens is when you rely on McKinsey, you have fewer and fewer of them until you're actually unable to make the decisions internally because all of the capacity and the skill has been outsourced to a private company.
Whoa, okay, so then...
Are you getting the horror movie aspect of this
I am.
yet, or?
I certainly am. And so now that we're in bed with McKinsey, privately and publicly, it seems like the damage has been done. What do we do now? How do we get out of bed? I mean, it's not just simply...
Can you extricate yourself from this? I mean, is that even doable?
Yeah, I think it's doable. It requires a certain kind of politics and a certain kind of political leadership. One of the ways to understand the populist uprisings that we've seen throughout the rich nations of the world is as disgruntled and unhappy populations saying, we don't want to be governed by people who are alien to us, who are experts above us and tell us what to do. And in a dark way, what leaders do is they turn that to an authoritarianism, to a hatred of the other, to a nativism, to a discriminatory motive. And what a skilled political leader does, and a virtuous political leader, is they take that energy and they say, look, we should be governing ourselves, but it's hard work, and it requires a politics in which we talk to each other across disagreements, in which we realize that you don't always win, but sometimes when you lose, the other side has legitimate claim to govern you, and together we reconstitute our democracy in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class democracy that takes back our own control from not just politicians, but also these kinds of technocratic corporate entities.
Mr. Markovits, I know you have to go. We want to thank you so much for your time and your insight. I hope we can chat again, because we certainly didn't have enough time to get through as much as we wanted to. But thank you so much. We do appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, and I am sorry this has been so short, too. And thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners for listening.
We will have you back. Daniel Markovits, author of The Meritocracy Trap, talking all about McKinsey. Again, that title of that article, if you want to read it, because you're hearing a lot more about McKinsey, is McKinsey and the Destruction of the Middle Class.
My mind is kind of blown right now.
Pretty amazing stuff.
Informative, interactive, and always interesting. This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
With the state of global politics shifting and becoming more divisive than ever, we're noticing our own political system is not immune. Things are changing politically, and those changes may radically change the political landscape as we know it. We spoke to Evan SOLOMAN at Eurasia Group about their newest report on the subject. So, I'm reading this story today, and of course, I saw the name Evan SOLOMAN, and we all know, if you're a fan here of CJD and have been listening for quite some time, Evan used to do the show from noon until 2, until he left to go to New York City to work for a group called the Eurasia Group, for a considerable sum of money. Some are suggesting 7, 8, 9, possibly 15 figures. But regardless, they have just come out with a new report, and this is interesting because we have talked about this in the past to try to make the connection that Canadian politics are becoming much more, sadly, like American politics.
It feels that way, for sure.
It feels that way. You could look at the Freedom Convoy and suggest perhaps that was an offshoot of this, but this report that has just come out is interesting beyond that, because Canada is included in the top 10 of the Eurasia Group's annual top risk report for the new year, which has just been released, and Evan SOLOMAN is on the line. Evan, thanks for being here this afternoon.
God, I hope it's 15 figures. I really hope.
Just lie to us.
I haven't heard that yet.
I haven't
heard that, but it's so great.
I was including decimal points and maybe a conversion to euros or something. So just
well, it is definitely not 15 figures, but it is an interesting place that to talk about geopolitics and to really get into this stuff. So thanks. First of all, awesome to be back. Both my kids live in Montreal, so I'm there all the time.
Oh, cool.
Great to have you back on our airwaves.
Absolutely. Well, let me start by asking this, because as I said, this has come up on our show before. We've thrown this out as a question and asking people if they believe this is really going on. Clearly, the Eurasia report suggests it is, about politics becoming more radicalized. Yet we see the same thing happening, not just here. We know what happened in Brazil just a couple of days ago. We know what's going on in China. How worrisome is this?
So on the top risks of 2023, one of the risks, the risk 8, is the divided states of America. And look, we all know American politics is divisive, although the midterm elections that we all just witnessed were maybe slightly less divisive. But you just saw, even among the Republican Party, they couldn't even elect a speaker, Kevin McCarthy, in 15 votes. The speaker, by the way, folks, is very powerful, third in line to be president after the vice president. So that's a big job. But the polarization there is being reflected here. And in our report, we have a section called Oh Canada that says, look, whether it's the protests around the vaccine mandates, you mentioned the trucker convoys, whether it's inflation, whether it's distrust, whether it's the housing market, whether there are lots of polarizations regionally going on. Look, we all know about the so-called two solitudes. But, there are more solitudes now. You've got separatist movements going on in the West as well. So one of the risks we've got is, even in a country like ours, both on the far left and the far right, there are divisive forces that are not just disagreements, but literally forces that are threatening the very fabric of the democracy, where you're no longer just disagreeing with people. People aren't your opponents. People are your enemies, which is very different in Canada.
Yeah, but as you say that, I think back to what always gets talked about. Those voices seem to be getting louder and louder, but they still haven't represent a very small minority of the Canadian population. So, they're clearly punching above their weight, and you kind of wonder at some point, will we realize that and not pay as much attention to it as we are?
Well, are they punching above their weight? If you look, for example, at the Premier of Alberta, she wanted to pass an act that would be unconstitutional, that a province could essentially undermine the charter and just say, you know what, we don't we no longer will respect those constitutional boundaries. Those are, now in the end, she's backed off. But those are serious challenges that we've got to pay attention to, because that's not about, I don't like your taxes, I don't like carbon tax, or I don't like this or that. That's, I don't think the system is right. And I'm going to openly defy it in ways that may not comply with the law. That's a whole different level of distrust.
Are the same kinds of issues being weaponized here in Canada as we're seeing elsewhere?
Look, it's not breaking news that the pandemic accelerated distrust of media, distrust of politicians, distrust of science, distrust of tech. So you got big tech, big science, big media. You know, we've got whole political parties that don't trust election cycles. Mm-hmm. The last 48 hours in Brazil was their January 8th was the U.S. January 6th. So the notion that people don't trust fundamental things or believe in things like the advent of the QAnon conspiracy theory, that is patently ludicrous, but it has millions of devoted followers. So, you know, to pretend that Canada's immune to this stuff is to put our heads in the sand. The question is, what's the big result of it? And look, let's keep our eyes on the main thing. We've got fundamental challenges. People can't pay for their groceries, and people are suffering from inflation, and they've been locked in their house for a long time, and their security's threatened. Those things accelerate distrust because people are looking for better answers. And we've got to get back to a world where we can disagree safely over some fundamental ideas, but we're all rowing in the same direction, which is to make sure that our quality of life goes up. We want our freedoms up. We want our quality of life up. We want our kids to have a better life than we have. And you ask around in 2023, and a lot of folks will say, I'm not sure that's the case anymore.
Okay, well, let me turn the clock back then. So what do you think, and I realize this is not necessarily what the report contains, what precipitated this? Because if you look back and say, well, Donald Trump's rise in 2016, that was the beginning, people will say, no, it was always there, it was always bubbling under, he just brought it forward. Do you agree with that? And if not, what did precipitate this?
I don't think there's one thing. Mm-hmm. I think Donald Trump is one factor. I think it's crazy to say it's only just one person and one movement. I think his movement, and that's the word he uses, about the deep state and the distrust and the culminating in what happened on January 6th, which was let's be clear, that was extraordinary. The U.S. Capitol under siege, that's unbelievable. The Vice President of the United States running for his life because of there was, for the first time, potentially not a peaceful transition of power. That's one factor. But remember, we've just been through the hothouse of the pandemic, where our civil liberties have been curtailed in a way. I mean, you know, let's speak in Montreal. For generations, the War Measures Act has impacted like a shadow over society. That was a short period of time. We've had our civil liberties curtailed because of a global pandemic in the spirit of public safety, maybe, but nonetheless curtailed for 2.5, 3 years. So this has accelerated that. And the other thing that's accelerated it is social media. Let's be clear. Mm-hmm. The technology that has allowed people to live inside there's no longer two solitudes. There's a million solitudes because you can live in an ecosystem where you never listen to anybody else except those who agree with you on whatever, clearly and forever. So you've got social media, you've got a pandemic, you've got economic hardship and disparity. So yeah, these are a lot of dry logs on a big fire. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to burn up. There's a lot of hope. Look, even though our top risk was rogue Russia. Russia's a big risk. But on one side, you're like, wait a second, 2023 may seem crappy, but the pandemic's ending, NATO's stronger than ever, Europe's more united than ever, American power is still unchallenged by maybe autocratic regimes like China. There's some good news out there. Technology has real possibilities. But let's be clear. It's hard to tell people good news in January of 2023 when inflation's over 7%. It's tough.
So it kind of sounds to me, though, like you're making the case that as the situation improves, as, the economic stability starts to return, as you said, like COVID ends, things just start to get better for the world in general, that this will all calm down, that the discontent will somehow disperse.
But does it? Is that the thinking?
I don't think so. And I don't think that there's I was talking to a big, someone who's an investor in one of the big institutional pension funds. Like, these are people that are in charge of all our retirement. And I said, what do you think is going to happen to the economy? Are we going to get through this whole period of disruption and conflict and war and inflation? And when is it getting back to normal? Isn't that like what we all want to know? And here's what he said. This is like a brilliant guy. And he said, I tell all my investors who put, this is a multi-billion-dollar fund. He said, there is no going back to normal. Things are changing. This is a new paradigm. We're not sure what's happening with China, with Russia, with technology, with climate change, with, economic stability. He said, we have to start rethinking things and not just expect to, quote, ride it out. Doesn't mean things are necessarily going to get worse, but we've got to start saying that it's not okay, just hang in there and ride it out. I think inflation will go down eventually. I think there's going to be a return to certain kind of normality. But is it going to be the same world that it was 3 or 4 or 5 years ago? And the answer is no.
Let me ask you one last thing, because we're running out of time here. With respect to the top risk countries, I think I mentioned Canada was in the top 10. It's not in the top 10. First of all, where are we? How much concern should there be here in terms of politics becoming radicalized? And who's at the top of this list?
Rogue Russia's our number one. Look, Russia can't win this war, so it's going to be a stalemate. And if he starts losing, Vladimir Putin may lash out. So rogue Russia is essentially very dangerous. That's our top risk. China under Xi Jinping, who's the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong after the 20th People's Congress that happened in October, we call it maximum Xi. We have not seen a Chinese leader this powerful since Mao. That is dangerous. That's risk number 2. You and I, the three of us spoke about weapons of mass disruption. New technologies, 3. Inflation is 4. Iran, don't forget about Iran, number 5. Energy, the transition, the energy crunch, and the increase in price of energy, that's number 6. And then the fact that for a lot of people around the world, their development is going down to 7. And then you get to divided America, divided Canada at number 8. And then the last 2 things real quick. TikTok boom. Folks, the most powerful generation coming up is Gen Z and Gen Z, however you want to call it. They're voting, they're powerful, and they're on TikTok, and watch them to reshape how we work, how we go to the office, and how we vote. And finally, this doesn't really resonate in Canada, but boy, around the world, water stress. There's droughts in the southwest of the United States, droughts around the world. Water stress is a top 10 risk this year. Watch for that to drive some conflict. So that's a real run-through of the top risks. I don't want to depress anyone because, hey.
Too late.
Too late.
Too late, I know. But
Happy New Year.
This wasn't the top hopes. This was the top risks.
You're right. To be fair. Well, it's great to have you back with us, and come see us anytime you're visiting your kids in Montreal.
And I definitely will. Montreal is my hope. That's why the kids are there.
Excellent.
All right, listen, you'll be very excited to know. I don't know if you saw this story, Evan, because you can miss big stories like this in New York, but Nike is coming out with a Montreal shoe, which is going to feature bagel seeds on the side of it. This is a true story, by the way.
You can't
Is that actually true?
Being released January 17th. What's it called? The Dunk? The Nike Dunk?
Don't try to eat it, Evan, okay?
Yeah.
It's not an edible shoe.
They better be the best shoes they make because they're now got the best bagels in the world. They better be the best shoes.
That's correct.
Evan Solomon at the Eurasia Group in New York. Evan, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Awesome to talk to you.
Take care.
Asking questions, looking for answers. Here's more of Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
Obesity in children is a problem that we've been hearing more and more about, but we haven't been hearing much on how to deal with it. Well, new recommendations have just been issued, including the possibility of surgery for kids as young as 12. Dr. LABOS explained why.
Ladies and gentlemen, came across a story today. Look, we have talked about, and it's not us, we've referred to these stories before, the obesity epidemic. That's what it's being called. And I see the numbers today, and we're going to talk with Chris LABOS in a sec. First time in 15 years, the American Academy of Pediatrics released new guidelines for treating childhood obesity. First time in 15 years. Here are the numbers. Now, remember, these are in the U.S. I imagine they're fairly comparable here. So, first of all, childhood obesity rates have continued to rise over the past years, I guess decade and a half now, from 17 to 20%. Since the 1980s, obesity rates have tripled in children and quadrupled in adolescents. Since the 1980s. That's not 100 years ago. Now, because of this, the suggestion is that we can treat childhood obesity with medication. They've even now decided perhaps a surgery might be the way to go for people, for children as young as 12 years old, which I'm sure to many people seem appalling that you would have to bring in surgery to treat obesity for a child. We wanted to talk more about this. Dr. Christopher Labos, of course, joins us from time to time. So, Dr. Labos, let's start off with this. It seems kind of radical just to see the word surgery for a 12-year-old. So why is this happening?
Well, it seems radical, but I would argue that it shouldn't be. Because the minute you change the paradigm and you change your thinking about obesity from a lifestyle thing to a disease that needs treatment, this is the treatment for obesity. 20, 30 years ago, there were no effective medications to treat obesity. Bariatric surgery was not a commonplace procedure. But nowadays, there is quite a lot of evidence to show that medications like semaglutide, which most people know as Ozempic, medications like semaglutide and bariatric surgery not only treat obesity, but prevent the complications of obesity. You can essentially cure diabetes if you have bariatric surgery. There's, quite a bit of evidence about that. You can prevent the cardiovascular issues that come from obesity and diabetes by performing bariatric surgery. So when you look at obesity as a medical problem that needs to be treated, the real question is, why wouldn't you want to treat a child that has this problem? Because you are going to be preventing the long-term medical issues that come with it. And so, yes, it's shocking because we are still, I think, to a certain degree programmed to think that obesity is something that you treat with diet and exercise, which is true. You obviously need to have a healthy lifestyle. But the medications and the treatments to take care of this problem now exist, and we have to recognize that for a lot of people, the problem with obesity is not simply a question of lifestyle. It is a complex metabolic and hormonal problem that has led them to develop this problem, which is not easy to treat with diet and exercise alone.
Okay, that addressed some of what because I was just thinking, how did we end up here? I mean, I know it's been a gradual thing. I know that kids are more sedentary, but there's more to it than that, it sounds like, Dr. Labos, when you talk about like thyroid and hormone conditions.
Well, here's the thing. Yes. Now, we are definitely more sedentary as a society than we were in the past, and we definitely have a poorer diet than we had in the past. But the solution to this is not as simple as telling people eat healthy. It's hard to eat healthy. If you've been grocery shopping recently, you know how expensive fruits and vegetables have become. And so if you're on a limited budget, you are more likely to eat junk food because you probably can't afford to eat fruits and vegetables. So when you create a situation where it's impossible for somebody on a limited budget to eat healthy, you can't then blame them essentially for eating unhealthy and having, the metabolic problems that come with it, like obesity, like diabetes, like high blood pressure. So there's a lot of very complex issues, and people say, well, why don't we treat the underlying problems? Yes, absolutely. We should address the issue of the high cost of food. We should absolutely address the issues of disparities in socioeconomic conditions that make it more likely for people who are less well off to develop medical issues. We have to address all of that. But you have a patient sitting in front of you that is suffering from obesity for a variety of reasons. Why would you not want to treat them with medications and surgical procedures that have proven to be wildly effective? Imagine now that you're a teenager who is overweight or obese for a variety of reasons. You have diabetes. You're taking medication for diabetes. If you could do a successful bariatric surgery and get it to the point where you can reduce and possibly even stop medication, I mean, that's essentially a cure. So we shouldn't we unfortunately sometimes tend to get locked into these ways of thinking and don't realize that the science has changed. So the reason why the American Academy of Pediatrics has updated its guidelines is because the science about weight loss medications and bariatric surgery has changed and has demonstrated itself to be an extremely successful intervention for preventing a lot of the problems that a lot of these children are going to be subjecting themselves to if we don't actually treat the medical issue they have, which is obesity.
Well, there are parents probably listening to this thinking, yes, my child perhaps is a little overweight now, maybe he's obese or she's obese now, but I believe that over time, some of these problems, some of this issue can be resolved on its own by lifestyle, by working out, by eating correctly, and that surgery is pretty much the most radical thing you can do. They would rather wait it out and basically let it play out and hope that things get better. Is that no longer, I guess, a result that makes sense anymore?
So let me ask you a question. Would you make the same argument if we were talking about high blood pressure?
No, we wouldn't.
Right? If you had a child with high blood pressure, would you just leave them with high blood pressure and hope that the problem would take care of itself?
Right.
Now, that's not to say that you can't also do lifestyle interventions, and you definitely should do lifestyle interventions. And in fact, in the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, they actually strongly recommend lifestyle interventions. And of course, an ounce of prevention is always worth a pound of cure. So all of the things that I mentioned before about making healthier food more affordable, all these societal issues that we have to go, incorporating physical activity into school curriculum so kids at least get the exercise that they might not getting at home, making it part of the regular school day. All of these things are important issues in terms of preventing obesity at a societal level. But this is a slightly subtler argument. This is if you have a child that is suffering for this problem, there are interventions and treatments available now that you can try. So definitely try to, change diet, exercise more. Absolutely. But if you have a patient that is suffering from this, and especially somebody who is suffering from the metabolic complications of this, like high blood pressure, like diabetes, leaving them untreated is not the most ideal path forward. These treatment options exist and should be considered for the people that have a major problem. This is not for somebody who's, a few pounds overweight or who's, maybe, not quite as fit as they should be, right? These are medical interventions for people who have actual medical problems. So if you meet the medical diagnosis, the medical definition for the metabolic complications of obesity, I think the reason why these guidelines were put out was to highlight to people these interventions exist, they are available, and they should at the very least be considered and discussed with patients and their parents and offered to them to know that this is an option that exists.
I want to get into a couple of things real quick before we have to wrap up. So someone is texting in right now, and this is true. We have to some degree normalize, maybe even glorified obesity to some degree. People say, well, if you're talking about this, you're automatically fat-shaming them. How much of this has come into play to read that we have seen numbers in adolescents, never mind kids, because they're almost the same, quadruple basically in the last 40 years by virtue of the fact that we're normalizing this is okay. You're still probably okay.
I think the problem is when things change very, very slowly, we sometimes don't realize how much they changed. Now, there's a difference between fat-shaming somebody and identifying a medical problem, right? If you're going to make the argument that you need to be thin to look beautiful, that is incorrect, right? And that's where the distinction lies. Because this is not a question of looking good. This is not a question of conforming to some sort of societal value. This is treating somebody that has a medical problem. If you have diabetes, and if you have diabetes because you have been overweight or have had obesity for some point of your life, that needs to be treated. That is a medical hormonal problem that can now be addressed because of new drug development. So we're treating a disease. We're not trying to address somebody's, what's the word I'm looking for, like body image or something like that. So there's a distinction to be made there. We're treating a medical diagnosis. We're not trying to conform to some sort of societal perception of beauty or something like that.
Okay. Look, I think, as I said, when we during the intro, this is going to be an eye-opener for, I think, a lot of people, right? Because we have reached the point now where we have to be very careful when we talk about obesity and fat shaming and everything else. And I wonder, when you see something this radical like surgery for a 12-year-old to control obesity, do you think this message sinks in that this is a solution?
I think it's a solution, and it's an important thing, right? Because, listen, you should never shame somebody for having obesity in the same way that you shouldn't shame somebody for having epilepsy. It's a medical diagnosis they have. Prior to this, we had no treatment. Now these treatments exist. Not everybody's going to be eligible, and it's not appropriate for everybody either, but they do exist, and that's the point, and sort of making people realize that these treatments are available, that this is not something radical or experimental. These are established medical procedures. They are going to be available, and they are going to be useful for the segment of society for whom they are medically appropriate, and that's the key. We have to look at it from the medical point of view, not from the societal point of view.
Last thing, really, really quick. What about the issue that if you have this bariatric surgery, people who have had it, it works for a while, but then eventually they get back to where they were to begin with?
I don't think that's strictly speaking true. There are some people who do regress, and of course, you can overeat for a variety of reasons, but they have been largely successful. When you look at the studies that have been done 6 months, a year out, there are some very, very radical improvements. And if you get to the point where you can stop your diabetes medications, if you are preventing heart attacks, now this is the adult population, obviously, but when you're seeing that kind of benefits, that's truly impressive. So it's not that there aren't occasional suboptimal results. Absolutely there are. But there have been many, very, very good successes.
And I would think the follow-up with a child being involved would be much more rigorous than perhaps that with an adult. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's a fair assumption, too. And don't forget, the easier you treat this problem, the easier it is. Of course, if you're talking about somebody who's in middle age and they've gained a lot of weight, it's very hard to keep that weight off as we get older. So the younger you can intervene, the younger you can prevent the problem, the better off you are. So treating these things in childhood is probably going to be better than letting them progress into adulthood when many of the issues may have become solidified in place.
Dr. Christopher Labos, appreciate it. Thanks so much. And Happy New Year, by the way. It's our first time talking to you this year.
Happy New Year to you, too.
Thank you. All right. So there you go. It's going to be interesting to see what reactions now. This is a fairly new story.
Yeah.
How will people react? How will parents react?
The stories in the news that are worth your time. Montreal Now with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall.
This week on the show, we had a very telling conversation about how the modern family structure just isn't really working with both parents working full time, So we asked, do you think we'll look back on this era of trying to do it all and say, what the heck were we thinking? And do you think when possible having one parent stay at home is a better option, even though it means having less money? You had a lot to say about that.
At the time, felt like, you have to have the career, you have to work, you have to come home, you have to take care of the kids, you have to clean the house, you have to do it all. And what I know now is it wasn't the right thing to do. I regret not having spent more time with the kids. Right now, I try and spend as much time as I can with my kids. There's no going back, but you know what? From today on, I can change that.
There is no going back. You can never get that time back you don't have with those kids, and that's what that one caller said when we asked this question first time around this afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. We were both quite moved by that.
Yeah, that was Stephanie, and she had a very successful career. She's around 60 now. She said her kids are grown. She's trying to make up for lost time.
We're asking you what you think. That's the question being posed right now. We have a full bank of calls here, so I want to get to them. But the idea is, does that model still work for you?
Yeah, basically, I think we're going to look back on this era and say, what the heck were we thinking? Do you agree that how we're doing it now, a modern family, just isn't working? Or have you found a way to make it work? And if so, we want to know how.
Share.
If you could be a stay-at-home parent, would you?
Maxine's on the line. Maxine, tell us about your situation.
If people look for a way for it to work, it could work. I'm telling you, they have to look for a way for this to work. Say, for example, if you drive 2 cars, you drop one and keep one. If you do not drive a car, take the public transit. It can work. You look for a way to tighten your belt. You take off all the expensive things that you have in a cellular phone, one phone in the house. That's what they used to have. And don't put all these features on the phone. It can work, and that money can save and put aside to school the child. You can tighten your budget, your belt around the waistline. It can work. By allowing the child, you don't buy expensive food, but you can eat modest food, good quality food, fruit and vegetables.
So you're saying it's financially feasible as long as you kind of,
doable.
As long as you're stricter about where you're spending and how you're spending.
Exactly, and you put aside for the rainy days.
Well, that's all well and good, but that's not going to buy you any time, is it?
Yeah, it will help.
Abby, what about you? What's your story?
Actually, we were talking about this at the dinner table last night. I feel that there needs to be a shift in society, and with COVID, I think people are seeing that. I'm also like the caller this afternoon. I just turned 58, and I still have a career. My husband had a career. He passed away 3 years ago, and that puts everything into perspective. Because you look back, and my kids, we spent a lot of time with our kids, even though we had 2 careers, but we were just surviving, not thriving. We had no downtime. Everything was always rush. And the only thing that saved us was that my husband was able to sometimes have more flexibility than I did in our work. But if I had to do it all over again, I think I would probably stay home. And don't get me wrong, we had a beautiful life. My kids, did not
want for anything. Yeah.
They did not want for anything, and they weren't spoiled, but I would have loved to I just told my daughter last week, I said, you know what, I was not that mom who baked cookies and muffins, was I? She said, no. She says, but that's fine. I still love you, But if I had to go back, I don't know. I think that the reason that our conversation got prompted at dinner is because of the story of those teenage girls who attacked that homeless man in Toronto for a bottle of alcohol. And my friend was telling me that a 13-year-old boy took a gun from his home and killed a teacher and shot at a teacher in the States. So there's an issue that is affecting society today. And then add to that social media, I feel that we're not headed in the right direction. And there has to be changes, and I believe it comes from family life. And again, if I had to go back, I would definitely probably should have stayed home. We would not have gone on so many trips. We would not have, gone to soccer games, hockey games, whatnot. But you know what? It doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's done, and
you can't go back.
I believe you can't go back, but there has to be a shift in society.
Okay.
And I'm in traffic right now, and all these people must be parents. And they're all going to rush home, try and pick up their kids at school, make dinner. Is that a life? I don't know.
Abby, I thank you for the call.
I hear you.
If I could go back in time.
hear you.
Andrea, I want to get as many as we can in here. Andrea, what about you? What's your story here?
Hey, so I was raised by 2 parents who worked. One worked days, one worked nights. And for me personally, I had a really competitive spirit. So I set myself goals by 40 to be a director, to have a 6-figure salary, and truthfully, 5 years later, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm going to pursue something a lot less demanding, with a lot less salary, just to give myself that time to spend with my kids.
That says it all.
Yeah, there's the
priorities,
example,
right? Priorities. You got what you always dreamed of, and then you're like, wait, that's not actually the dream come true.
At the end of the day, yeah.
Wow.
Thank you for that call. Joanne, how about you? What do you think?
Hi, I was a stay-at-home mom. And I loved it. I loved every minute. We lived on one salary. It was tight. But I think my biggest takeaway, because now I have children and I have grandchildren, I think my biggest takeaway as women, we need to support each other in our decisions that we make. And I've seen it. I still remember going to a dinner that my husband was working at, and you go around the table, and they said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, I stay at home with my kids. And this is what I got. Oh. And I think I'll never forget that oath. To me, it was such disdain that, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, as women, support each other with the choices that you make, whether you work at home, whether you work outside of the home. Support each other. And I think, I agree, families, it's more difficult. I work at an elementary school, and I see it. It is difficult, but I think the government needs to support the families in the sense to help us bridge that gap. And I think just as women, support each other in the choices that we make.
Great call.
You bet.
Call,
absolutely. Thank you. I pictured that at the table when she described that scene. So what do you do? I'm a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. I've been in scenes like that, and it's, and they're made to feel like somehow it's not okay.
Alyssa, what's your story on this? What do you think?
I was actually listening earlier when you first started talking about this, and there's a lady that came on that says, if you can't afford to have kids, then you shouldn't have them if you can't stay at home with them. I'm a single mom. I raised 8 kids by myself. 8. I worked a job and I worked overtime to provide for my kids to make sure they had what they needed. I'm not sending my kids to school with no cell phone because in this day and age, I don't know what happens in the schools. And I want my daughter and my kids to be able to call me and say, you know what, this is what's going on in the school. I don't believe this whole, if a parent wants to work, let them work. If they don't want to work and they stay home, my mother was able to stay home until we were in high school. But that was a different era.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we cannot do that now. The society is not, the monetary, it doesn't add up.
I got time for one more here. Liz, go ahead. Tell us your story.
Hi. So yes, for myself, I really don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's a personal choice. Every family has to figure out what works for them. I think finances are a huge factor for a lot of people. My husband and I both worked until we had kids. I decided I wanted to stay home. I ended up staying home till both of my kids went to kindergarten. But we did have to really tighten in the finances. But it was a choice I made and I won it. And then I found my way back into my career slowly as the kids went to elementary school, and as they're getting older, I can, do more and more things that I want to do. But I think, there's a balancing act that you play there, and I don't think it should fall on the shoulders of the women all the time to have to take that.
Agreed.
I think it could be the man or the woman. I think, who has the interest, the time. And I want to bring up grandparents and other people. If you're a busy person, if you and your spouse are both working all the time, don't think that your children are not going to get the attention and the care and the love that they need. Put them in programs, have them, be visited by other family members. It shouldn't just be the responsibility of the two parents, to do everything for their children. We all know the expression that, it takes a village to raise a kid. And I really think that's a big part of it. Include the village.
Liz, thank you so much. Again, a terrific
And we
call.
don't have to be superheroes.
There you go. This is a great topic, and we probably could have gone on for we're a little late here.
I mean, that's 2 full segments. We had full banks of calls. People had a lot to say about it.
Interesting, huh? Thank you so much. Appreciate the calls, and certainly appreciate your texts. I wish we could have gotten to more of them. That's this edition of The Week That Was here on the iHeartRadio Network. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Natasha Hall, and we will see you next week.
Have a wonderful week.
This has been the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand and Natasha Hall. Listen live on your radio weekday afternoons from 2 to 6 on CJAD 800 or through the iHeartRadio app.